In the morning sky of Paris, a golden glow illuminated the Haussmann-style facades, casting elegant shadows on the sidewalks.
The opera district, where luxury and refinement mixed with the frantic pace of the capital, gently came to life under the hurried footsteps of passers-by. In this excitement, a woman with a proud bearing advanced with measured steps, her silhouette reflecting the assurance of a life built on excellence and hard work. Clarice Beaufort, Chief Judge of the Court of Appeal, was a woman of rare presence. At 46 years old, she embodied authority and elegance, her fine features framed by brown hair with auburn highlights. Every detail of her outfit, her impeccably fitted beige suit, her discreet but assertive heels, and her simple but refined leather bag, testified to sure taste and natural rigor. However, despite what her appearance conveyed, Clarice knew that for some, her presence in such a prestigious setting was still an anomaly. She approached her vehicle, a sleek black sedan, a model that only the successful could afford. As she was about to open the door, the sound of an engine made her turn her head slightly. In her rearview mirror, she saw a police car suddenly stop behind her. The screech of tires on the asphalt disturbed the hushed silence of the morning. A man in uniform came out slowly, with the confidence of someone who feels invested with absolute power. He was tall, lean, his face marked by hard features and a closed expression. His cold, piercing eyes analyzed the scene with a glimmer of suspicion. On his uniform, a badge glittered in the morning light: Agent Dupont. Clarice was not surprised. She had already experienced this type of questioning, too often for it to still surprise her. Yet, each time, a new weariness was added to the silent indignation she carried within her. Agent Dupont approached her with studied slowness, his hand resting casually on his belt where his weapon hung. "Ma'am, I have to ask you to stop." His voice was sharp, imbued with undisguised authority. Clarice looked at him calmly, lifting her chin slightly. "May I know why?" The agent glanced knowingly at the luxury sedan before returning his attention to it. "You drive a high-end car, and let's just say, I have doubts about your right to own it." A silence ensued, heavy with innuendo. Clarice felt anger rise within her, not because she was surprised, but because the arrogance of this police officer was almost caricatured. He didn't even bother with a legitimate pretext. He said out loud what so many others were thinking: a black woman in a luxury car could only be suspicious. She kept her calm, accustomed to navigating these troubled waters where respect had to be extracted rather than granted naturally. "I am the owner of this vehicle, and I am also the chief judge. Please let me continue on my way." But Dupont didn't care about his title. He raised an eyebrow, crossing his arms over his chest with an expression of feigned doubt. "It's a bit easy to say that, isn't it?" he said with a smirk. Clarice understood immediately. He wanted to play. He relished this confrontation, sure of his ascendancy.
"Show me your papers."
She held back a sigh. She knew he wasn't trying to verify an infraction. He simply wanted to humiliate her, force her to justify her presence in a neighborhood where, according to him, she had no place. Slowly, she opened her bag and took out her driver's license and the vehicle's registration document, which she handed to him with controlled patience. Dupont took the documents and examined them with an exaggeratedly scrutinizing eye. His fingers touched the paper with an almost provocative slowness, as if he expected to discover some compromising detail. Finally, after an unnecessarily prolonged inspection, he raised his head and stared at her with a smirk. "That's all well and good, but let's be honest. I've never seen a woman in your class drive a car like that." There was a glint in Agent Dupont's eyes, a bitter mixture of condescension and contempt, a look that Clarice knew too well. It was the same look she had seen years before, in college lecture halls, in the cold corridors of courthouses, and even in cozy meetings where men in suits imagined themselves above her. A look that did not see the Chief Justice that she had become, but only the black woman that they refused to consider at her true value. Clarice took a deep breath, controlling the icy anger that threatened to pierce the facade of her calm. She had no desire to engage in a sterile confrontation. It was not his role to stoop to this kind of struggle. But the humiliation of this situation, the symbolism of this abuse of power, could not remain unanswered. It was not just about her, but about all those who suffered this same silent contempt every day. Without trembling, she took out her cell phone. Her fingers, perfectly calm, dialed a number that she knew by heart. The deep, calm voice of Attorney General Antoine Delacroix responded almost immediately.
Antoine, it's Clarice.
I am being held back unnecessarily by a police officer who is clearly abusing his authority. I would like you to intervene. His voice was clear, devoid of any apparent emotion, but each word was a sharp blade. Dupont, hearing the conversation, arched an eyebrow, an amused grin appearing on his lips. He still thought it wouldn't matter. After all, how many complaints against police officers disappear through the twists and turns of bureaucracy? How often does the arrogance of a uniform erase the voice of a citizen? Clarice calmly put her phone away and looked the agent straight in the eyes. Agent Dupont, I advise you to immediately stop this arrest. I just contacted the Attorney General. You are abusing your power. For a brief moment, Dupont's face lost its luster. A slight pallor crossed his features, betraying the doubt that was creeping into him. But he quickly pulls himself together, his ego too big to admit the slightest flaw.
¿De Attorney General?
He sneered, feigning indifference. Do you think this changes anything? The law is the same for everyone, Madam Judge. His words oozed irony. He knew he had gone too far, but he clung to this thin thread of power, unable to back down without losing face. Clarice did not answer. She knew that some battles were not won with words, but with actions. A few minutes later, an inconspicuous black car urgently parked near the scene. From it came Antoine Delacroix, tall, elegant, dressed in a dark coat which fluttered slightly in the wind. His face, marked by years of commitment to defending rights, wore a harsh expression. His piercing blue eyes scanned the scene with calculated coldness. He moved forward with a firm step, ignoring Dupont and heading directly towards Clarice.
Clarice, is everything okay?
He asked in a deep voice, placing a reassuring hand on her shoulder. Clarice nodded slightly. She didn't need to complain. His simple presence was enough to bear witness to the injustice suffered. Delacroix then turned to Dupont, his gaze piercing the uniform as if seeing through the facade of fictitious authority.
Agent Dupont, I am Attorney General Antoine Delacroix.
You are currently committing a clear abuse of power. Your behavior is not only unacceptable, but also legally reprehensible. A frozen silence settled. Passers-by, attracted by the scene, stopped, taking out their phones to film the exchange. Dupont, this time, could no longer hide his distress. His face, at first red with anger, turned white with poorly concealed worry. He then understood that it was not a simple routine incident. He clumsily tried to defend himself. I was just doing my duty. There was reason to suspect. Suspect what?
Cut Delacroix sharply.
A black woman driving a luxury car? Is this your only justification? You are an agent of the Republic, not an arbiter of your own prejudices. Dupont stammered, unable to formulate a coherent response. He looked around, searching for support that didn't exist. The crowd was silent, but collective indignation hung in the air. Finally, trapped by his own arrogance, Dupont took a step back. Very well, you can go, madam. He snapped, his voice reduced to a bitter whisper. Clarice did not answer. She got into her car with dignity intact, her gestures as measured as ever. Delacroix followed her with his gaze, then turned again to Dupont.
It's not over.
Expect consequences. And indeed, the story did not end there. Clarice knew that it was impossible to let such an abuse of power go unpunished. It was not just a matter of personal pride or revenge, but a fundamental principle. If she, the Chief Justice of the Court of Appeal, could be treated like this, what about the thousands of other voiceless, powerless, defenseless people? It was a responsibility she could not ignore. She made the bold decision to sue Officer Dupont, not only for the humiliating incident she suffered, but for everything he represented, a symbol of systemic discrimination rooted in institutions. Clarice knew that this fight would go beyond the walls of the court. It was an act of resistance against a system that is too often complicit in silence and injustice. The affair quickly made a big splash. The media seized on it, fascinated by the irony. A black judge, guardian of the laws, had to fight against the injustice embodied by a man responsible for enforcing them. The front pages of the newspapers carried striking headlines: "Justice for the Judge," "Clarice Beaufort facing police abuse," or even "When the law must defend itself." Agent Dupont, confident and arrogant, thought he could escape any punishment. After all, he had seen other police officers emerge from similar situations unscathed. He still believed that his uniform protected him, that the institution would cover his mistakes. He even showed a smug smile during the first hearings, convinced that this would only be a passing storm. What he didn't know was that the tide had already turned. Karma, this invisible but implacable force, had set in motion. Clarice and her team of lawyers specializing in civil rights, led by the formidable Master Karim 8 Ben, an expert recognized for his incisive pleadings, dug into Dupont's past. What they discovered was overwhelming: a lengthy history of abuse of power, hushed-up complaints, and accounts of racial discrimination that had been silenced. The evidence piled up, but it was the power of social media that amplified the scandal. The videos of Clarice's abusive arrest, filmed by passers-by, went viral. We saw an authoritarian, contemptuous Dupont, refusing to listen to a black woman who nevertheless remained disarmingly calm. Online comments were fierce, with public anger growing. Dupont's face became that of a much larger problem: the embodiment of police abuse and institutional racism. The trial opened in a packed room, under the watchful gaze of cameras and journalists. The atmosphere was electric. It wasn't just Clarice's case against Dupont, it was the entire society that stood symbolically in this court. Clarice spoke with a firmness and dignity that imposed silence. Her voice resonated, not like that of a victim, but like that of a woman standing up in the face of injustice. What I experienced that day was not a simple incident. It is the reflection of a system where the arrogance of power feeds on prejudices. It is not only my humiliation, but that of all people who, every day, are judged not for what they do, but for who they are. His words struck the assembly with the force of a truth ignored for too long. She spoke of the silent pain of daily discrimination, of the fatigue of having to prove one's legitimacy in spaces where one's competence should have been enough. But she also spoke of hope, of the possibility of change, of a justice that would not just be a word written on the pediments of the courts. For his part, Dupont tried to defend himself, claiming misunderstandings and errors of interpretation. But his justifications rang hollow in the face of overwhelming evidence and his troubled past. His confidence gradually crumbled, replaced by palpable nervousness. Where he had once counted on impunity, he found only emptiness. The verdict was delivered after hours of deliberation. The court sentenced Agent Dupont to an immediate suspension of several months, accompanied by an obligation to undergo intensive training on racial bias, professional ethics, and civil rights. Even more symbolically, he was officially found guilty of discriminatory abuse of power. But Dupont's real defeat did not lie only in the sentence. He had lost much more: his credibility, his arrogance, and the illusion of invincibility that the uniform gave him. Where he thought he was protected, he found himself exposed, naked in the face of the truth. Clarice's victory was not limited to her personal case. It became a catalyst, a starting point for national awareness. Citizen movements were organized, debates were launched on television sets, and voices that had been suppressed for too long finally found an echo. Reforms began to emerge. Diversity awareness programs were established in law enforcement, listening cells for victims of abuse of power were created, and laws were proposed to strengthen the transparency of internal investigations into police conduct. Clarice, for her part, continued to carry out her duties with the same rigor, but her aura had changed. She was no longer just the Chief Justice. She had become a symbol of resilience and courage. Her struggle inspired generations of women and men to stand up, claim their rights, and believe in the power of justice, even in the face of its own contradictions. And even if the road remained long, one thing was certain: The story of Clarice Beaufort proved that dignity and truth are weapons more powerful than any uniform or badge.